Really good to see everyone. And it's great to hear about all your amazing wins over the last few weeks. I can't believe you're already a month in the program. So we know that we've got 2 months left. But it's great to see a lot of you are making some amazing progress. So well done. The reason why we wanted to run this session, I just wanted to give you sort of a bit of a background, is that there's a lot of people in this cohort who are sort of at that early stage of their sort of startup journey. And this session, the goal is essentially to make sure that we talk about what you're going through on a sort of like on a founder basis, and then how can you transition to become a CEO. Now, I understand that not everyone in this cohort will want to be a CEO or will be an actual CEO of their company, but there's a lot of lessons that you can take away that are applicable to your work. And essentially, the sort of session is targeted at the sort of early stages, or pre-seed, seed stage, both individuals, founders, but also particularly teams. And really, the sort of what I'm talking about here, the key points are taken from a book called The Great CEO Within, and that's by Matt Mockery, who is a startup coach based in Silicon Valley, and he sort of compiled this book based on different lessons and work that he's been doing. I actually got recommended this book by a friend of Catalysr, Pasha Ryan, who some of you might know. He is a local Aussie entrepreneur. He co-founded a company called Untitled Chapter, which supports virtual internship opportunities. And they went through the Y Combinator program and recently also raised a sort of funding round as well. So that's been, I guess, the sort of like context behind this. And he sort of shared this with me, I believe, last year. And since, like I've read this book, and I've sort of like, and also reflected on some of the lessons that I've learned through this journey by working with different founders, a lot of the things really ring true. So I'll talk about those sort of key aspects from the book, but also, add in things from my own side. And the way that we're going to do this is, we'll talk about basically from now to about 5:30, 5:40, just some of the content that I've sort of like selected that I want to touch on. And Marlo will also share this book with you as well. So if there's anything on top of that you want to miss, then you'll sort of take a look after the session. So Marlo, feel free to sort of share that on Slack with people. And then we'll also do a bit for Q&A. So I know there's a couple of questions that people are asking on the Slack channel, but beyond that as well, this is something that, I guess like there's other questions that you have that you're working with. So would love to get a bit of discussion as well. So probably halfway through. So that's a bit of a preamble to what we're going to talk about. What I really want to make sure that I talk about here is that this is not about the technical aspects of building a startup, because a lot of that stuff is stuff that you learn in Lean Startup. You learn with another amazing book called Discipline Entrepreneurship by Bill Olet that I sort of talked about previously to some of you. And also, what you're talking about with your EIRs. So like a lot of that stuff, I would say, is something that I'm assuming that you have either gone through or you are going through, and have good EIRs who can help you with. So this is really about making sure that our focus is on you as the founders and as the individuals who are running your organizations. And basically, when you look at this book, the book is in different sections. And the first two sections are the ones that are most relevant to you at this early stage. So the first section is basically about starting out as you're starting on your startup journey. And the second section is about basically some individual habits and things that you can take that again have been tried and tested methods that have really proven effective for a lot of founders over the last few years. So sort of jumping into that, like we'll talk about those things and I'll mention those key points, and then we can do a discussion. If you have any questions or any comments that are sort of coming up, feel free to type them in as we go along, as I'd like to go through the content first, and then we can jump into a bit of a broader discussion. In terms of what we'll cover today from the book. So it's going to be the first two sections focusing on some key points on getting started, and then about some individual habits for yourself as founders, and then other sections that you can read in your own time whenever you want to. But these are the reason why I've sort of picked these two is because they are the ones that are the most relevant to most of you. And also, if you want to have any follow-up conversations, whether that's coaching, whether that's sort of further support on any of this stuff, very happy to also have that on a one-on-one basis. So digging in, basically, I guess the sort of framing for this is, that really, when you're starting a startup, right, the sort of first and the fundamental thing that we've talked about that, you all know now, is the goal of a startup is to try and solve a problem, and try and solve a problem, and for real people. And I think the sort of focus should never go away from that. So whenever you are working on your startup, that's something that I would say is like the key lesson. And for those of you who might have sort of watched something like Star Trek, that's the prime directive, is really to make sure that you're focusing on listen to your customers, obsessing about your customers, understanding your customers, and actually trying and solving that problem. We have seen this happen countless times where people and founders who are amazing founders, but they start with falling in love with the technology or falling in love with the solution, but really what you should be doing is falling in love with your potential customers and their problems, and trying to come up with ways in which you can solve that. And really, to be able to do that, another thing that I want to sort of mention is, and I know like different teams have different people, so some of you are individuals, others have co-founders, but I would say, like, if given a choice, and if and when I am starting a startup, I would always choose to work with other co-founders. And the reason why I say that is because there's a few things in there, right? First is, you as an individual don't really know everything, right? So it takes self-awareness and humility to know that. I think another aspect of this is that starting a startup is really hard. There's a lot of things involved. You are fighting against some fierce competition as well, oftentimes some entrenched competition. So it's really important that you have team members and you have sort of co-founders that you can rely on and support each other. So beyond just a sort of technical skill set, it's also important to have someone that you can work with and share the load. So that's the reason why I highly recommend you to have co-founders. So for those of you who already have co-founders, that's amazing. If you don't, I would definitely recommend thinking about getting co-founders, because that will really, really help you. And you can even talk to the people who are, who already have co-founders, and they can tell you, like some of the benefits and advantages of having that. But at the same time, there's no need to rush into it, because a co-founder relationship, as I've talked to a few of you now, is kind of like a marriage, because oftentimes the startup journey can take 7, 10 plus years. And so, you are stuck with some of these co-founders for life. And it's really important that you really choose carefully who you work with. So it's important to work with co-founders, but at the same time, a very good co-founder can really add a lot of value to the work you're doing. If you have a co-founder that doesn't fit, then the problem can also be that they can take value away from your startup and can actually even kill your startup. So it's really important. It's a very, very important decision. So that comes down to trust. That comes down to understanding people and their skill sets. And not only that, but also how are they going to work in a high pressure environment with a lot of uncertainty. So you have to be a really good judge of character and to be able to see and sense and test whether people are going to sort of fit up to that. And a really good way of doing that is actually going out and talking to people, to doing some smaller projects with them. For example, if you already know them to university or through your work, that's a great indicator because you know their past behavior. But if you don't know people, then you do working on a hackathon together or working on other smaller problems together can help you really, suss out if that person would work with you on that particular thing. And it's important to, to have a bit of a trial and a grace period before you jump into that relationship. Having said that, on the sort of flip side of this is there can also be sometimes too many co-founders. And so that's another thing that I also wanted to talk about, that, shouldn't have more than 3 or 4 co-founders ideally, because the more co-founders you have, and the more team members generally you have, particularly in an early stage startup, it leads to more complexity. So it is really important to think of, well, how many people do you want to have in that early stage team, and particularly as co-founders and sort of employees, because oftentimes the startups want to look at these sort of vanity metrics. They want to either raise a lot of money really quickly, or they want to scale really quickly, and sometimes that goes against what their actual mission is, what they're trying to do, because every single team member that you add or a co-founder that you add will add more complexity to your team, and it will really add exponential complexity, because you'll have to do a lot of communication. You'll have to come up with like new systems and processes to make sure that everyone's on the same page. So super important that you actually do that, that you spend the time and you try to curate a team in the early days, which is absolutely necessary. So whilst it's important to have co-founders, it's also important not to have too many co-founders and too many team members at the start. A good rule of thumb is to have somewhere between two to four people as co-founders, and in early stage teams, probably 2 to 6 people in total. So if that helps you with that. So that's just talking a bit about your team. The next thing that I wanted to mention was product. And again, this is something that many of you are sort of going through right now. You've got an MVP or you've already got a product in the market that you're testing. The first product that you will make, or your website or whatever you're selling, is most likely going to be a prototype, right? And so I would say have the mindset of prototyping and take whatever product you're building and test it early, because the most useful thing is feedback that you can get from your customers, right? There is many founders who, again, fall into this trap of building and delaying the launch of their product because they want to build a perfect solution. But actually, the problem with that is that like sometimes you spend a lot of time and energy and money building something, but then realize that that's not something that people want. So you really want to make something that people want. So build something. It can be, as long as it can deliver value to your customer, and that's why we talk about the minimal viable products, the MVP. So build that and then get it out in the market as quickly as possible. Think about it as your prototype. Test it with your customers. Get that early feedback, and let that decide what their product should look like. Then I guess it's important to also think about like what is like some other terms mean, like in sort of startup terminology. So one of the things you will hear a lot about other than MVP is product market fit, and this is particularly being talked about. Okay, a specific startup has achieved product market fit or haven't achieved product market fit, and one of the ways to think about it is that when you will achieve product market fit, when both your customers are buying your product, but they're also either becoming returning customers, or also recommending your product to other people, right? Because the best sort of way of marketing, particularly in the early stage startups, is through word of mouth. And so it's really, really important as you sort of grow and you sort of build your product and build your customers, is to, whenever you get that point where you have too many customers or you have too many people who are coming and knocking on your door saying, hey, why is your product not coming out? You should tell us what's happening and so on. That's when that you've achieved product market fit, right? So it is not something that you like when you get it, you will know, because you will have so much demand that you have to turn people away. And you have to fire your customers, which is a good thing. So really, really important to know that where don't take product market fit as something that okay, I've tested something and it worked with like 10 people and I've got product market fit. That's not true. That means that your product might have potential, but it doesn't mean that you actually have product market fit. And you can measure this through different metrics, right? You can measure it through looking at renewal rates. You can measure it by doing NPS, Net Promoter Score, and other things like that. So again, that's stuff that like we can talk about offline if anyone's interested in sort of digging deeper. And also for those of you who are looking at enterprise or B2B customers, another important thing, is like a trap that people fall down in, is that they might have, bigger companies that might test their product and might give them some money in the early days, and they take that as validation for their product. I mean, it is validation yet the product works, but it's not validation that they have product market fit. And so they take that as product market fit, where it's not. The best way to know whether you have product market fit or not as a B2B company is when you have long-standing contract with someone, right? So can you sign someone up for like 3, 4, 5 years contract, and so that they become your recurring customers? That will tell the difference whether you genuinely have product market fit. And if you don't, then oftentimes the reason is that like big companies have budget to try out new things. And sometimes they'll try you out, but then whatever you're offering might not be delivering enough value, and therefore they're moving on. So it's really important to be honest and clear with yourself, with your team, with your advisors, and know what stage you're at. And if you're not at product market fit stage, it's totally fine as well. But it's important to know that, right? And it's important to be honest and transparent about that, because that's what will help build trust, not only with your advisors and your team, but also with funders and sort of other stakeholders. And it will also help you iterate and improve your product until you get to that stage where you do get that product market fit. So that's I guess a bit about that around your product. And most of this book, I would say, probably after chapter 10 and onwards, that Marlo has shared already on Slack, is focused on people who and startups who have product market fit. So like the way that the book roughly defines is that you have like over $1 million annual recurring revenue, or 20 or so staff, and you're building some management systems and so on. So at that stage, a lot of decision making, a lot of other different systems become really, really important in your startup journey. And so you can look that up when the time is right. But I would say that most of you are not at that stage yet, right? So we'll try and bring it back to what's relevant to you and what applies to you at this current stage. So what is most relevant to you in this stage is really talking about the individual habits, about you as the CEO and founders of the company. We talked about this, I believe it was 3 weeks ago now, about culture and how important culture is when you're building your startup. So as a part of your, I guess as you're building your startup, you are that architect of your culture, and really the central sort of information source. So it's really important that you think about your own actions and what you do and your own habits, because that will not only, I guess, inspire or the team around you, but it will also set up some sort of norms and processes that will basically be there for the rest of the organization's life, and is oftentimes very hard to change, right? So it's really important to work on yourself, to work on yourself as a startup, and try to improve your personal systems and your personal processes, because that will really help you not only become more productive and efficient, but also in setting up the right foundation for your startup. And there's a few key things in there in terms of individual habits that I wanted to touch on. So first thing, and again, you can sort of follow the book as well to see these things. So I've sort of taken the same approach in terms of taking the key items. The first one was getting things done. So I think this is something that, I mean, is the obvious one that, we all want to make sure that we are the most productive, we get things done, and I can be honest here and vulnerable and say, look, I mean, I don't always excel at this, right? There's some times where I'm good at it, there are other times where I really suck. But it is important that you try and set up these systems, you try and improve. And for you, those systems can look different, right? So it could be something like, you have a Slack and a Trello, or you have like a piece of paper that you write stuff on, whatever it is. You can think about particular systems that work for you. Yeah, definitely. Marla would agree with that. And the reason why Marla works with us is because, she's helping us with, operationalizing some of these things and really helping us put these systems in place, because I'm hopeless when it comes to this. And I guess the other aspect of this is, when you're thinking about getting things done, it's also about like batching things and making sure that you spend time doing things that are absolutely essential, right? So for me, that the sort of key things, what I'm working at Catalysr currently is focus on fundraising and sort of external relations and building the brand of the company, as well as to support coaching and some of you as founders, and staying in touch with our alumni. So those are, I would say, like some of the high level things for me. And whereas for Marlo, it's more focused on like making sure the program's running effectively, ensuring that she's in touch with everyone, organizing different events, managing and working with different EIRs and other mentors and so on. So we've got those clear distinction of different responsibilities and what we're doing as a part of the organization. And different organizations will have different things. You will have marketing, sales, customer service, et cetera, depending on the type of organization you have, the complexity you have, and how many staff you have. But whatever whatever the size and the complexity of your company is, it's really important to focus on your key top goals, and what they are, right? So what is it that your role should be doing? And so one of the things that Matt talks about and recommends here is that you should spend at least 2 hours every day on that top goal, right? So for me, it is something like fundraising, or like developing proposals or writing up grant applications. For different people, it's different things. So he's recommended 2 hours a day. Ideally early in the morning or when you wake up, because that's when you have the most energy. But what I've personally found is I tried that method. It didn't work for me in the same way. So what I sort of, I guess, moved to is that I've divided up my days according to either days which are more focused on task work or more focused on deep work. And so there's some days where I'm doing a lot of meetings or doing a lot of task works, like, replying to a lot of emails, doing invoices, a lot of the stuff that is just basically catching up and working in the organization. And then there are days when I'm doing deep work and really working on the organization. And that is focused on, for example, writing up a grant proposal or thinking about a new strategy, or like improving my own skill set in some areas. And so like I've tried to distinguish different days in the week to focus on those things, and I try to abide by, where possible, sort of these frameworks, because that really helps me set up a structure for myself. It's particularly important right now because all of us are working remotely, and so you are basically in charge of your own calendar, and therefore, and particularly as a startup, you don't necessarily have other sort of like, like your boss is not going to tell you what to do. So you have to decide how you spend your time. And you have a lot of autonomy, but to be able to deal with that autonomy, you have to set up some structure and be really disciplined and focused. And yes, so Marla is also mentioning that there's a really important distinction between working on the business and in the business. And both of them are important. Your role as CEO, and founders in the early days is obviously to work on both, but then eventually the goal is to empower your teams and to build your startup to a stage where you do less work in the business and more work on the business, because that will help you grow and scale your initiatives. This is one of those things in terms of, what is the top goal and how do you work best, is something that you would know better based on your personality type. So I wouldn't say there's like a one best way of doing this, but I would definitely say that you can use an experimental approach on this. And I wrote a blog piece a while ago called The Paradox of Productivity. That's on Medium, that you can go and check out if you're interested, which talks about some of this stuff as well. The next thing that I wanted to mention, again, taken from the book, is this concept of being on time and being present for particular meetings and sort of engagements as the founder and the CEO. So this is something that I think is important generally, but is really, really important, particularly for people now that we come from so many different cultural backgrounds and diverse, lived experiences. Something that I have had to personally, struggle with, coming from Pakistan, is when we say 8 a.m., we mean 8:30 or 9 or 10, depending on the context, right? So it really varies with people. Whereas, like I think, in Australia, but also more generally, I would say like a really good habit is whatever time you say you're going to show up, particularly in the professional setting, that's when you show up, right? If it's 9 a.m., it's 9 a.m. If it's 10, it's 10. And if you are running late, because eventually that will happen, whether that's another meeting running over, or, like something else happens, whenever you know that you're going to be running late, it's a good idea to tell the other person or people that you're meeting with that you're going to be running late, and use whatever the quickest method of communication is. So is that WhatsApp? Is that Slack? Is that email, phone, whatever it is, that you're connected with that person? It sort of respects their time. B, it builds some trust. And this is something, again, that, like sometimes I struggle with as well still, but this is something that is super, super important, that you try to be on time all the time, because it will really help build your reputation and also build trust with the people that you're working with. The second thing here is also making sure that you're present. This is an activity I think that is happening more and more often now, that a lot of us are using our smartphones, or now that we're all on Zoom, for example, that you're in a meeting or in a particular session, you could be looking at reading another blog piece, or checking your phone or doing anything else. Whereas again, it's sort of like in respect of other people who are working with you, but also just so you can have the most effective and productive use of everyone's time, it's important to be present, right? And also to set up the right culture for your organization, because if you do these things, for example, when you're checking your phone or doing other things and not focusing on the sort of subject matter at hand, then what the signal that it sends to other people in your team or other stakeholders is, well, this person isn't really serious, or that's the culture and that's something to expect, and this meeting really isn't important. So really, it's really important to make sure that you reflect on the things you do, because you as an individual, it's not just about you anymore, it's about your startup, and whatever you do will reflect on your startup, whether that's internally for your employees or your team members, or externally for different stakeholders that you're working with. And different people will take different takeaways, and for some people these things will be smaller things, for other people will become really big red flags. So it's really important to be mindful and sort of reflect on this stuff. So I know this is a lot, it seems very preachy, and I'm sort of going through the list and telling you some of these things, but the reason why I'm telling you this is this is something that it's not just written in the book, it's something that I've personally seen implemented, have either been successful with or have failed, that I've tried to improve in, but I know that this is stuff that works, and when you do it right, it makes big difference, right? Another thing that I wanted to mention here is, like a really important point around writing stuff down. Again, this is stuff that I personally struggle with, but I think is important, to do that, where, whenever you have stuff that you're repeating all the time, it's ideal to write it down, write it in a Google Doc in the beginning, make a wiki, something else, because it's a really good way for you to, I guess, operationalize and also, like make sure that you systematize whatever you're doing. So we're lucky we've got Marlo who's helping us, do a lot of that, and we'll even have like a resource directory of all the different things and different resources that I often talk about, or the different EIRs and mentors I've talked about in the past. So you will be able to, look at that. But also, now we can also record a lot of these conversations, right? And so it's up to you, whatever your style is. If you want to write stuff down, if you want to record a video, a really neat tool that I recently discovered, which I think will be useful for people, is called Loom. So it's like Zoom, but with L. And basically what it does is that you can, do a presentation and record it at the same time. So your face will show up as well as your presentation. And it's really, really handy tool. And you can also integrate it with your Gmail and other places like that. And one other aspect of, I guess, be like good habits and like, something to think about as a sort of founder and CEO is gratitude. And this is something that will not only make you happy of like, being grateful for what you have and what you're doing, but also, it's something that, you can show that appreciation for other people, who are working with you. As I said earlier, startup journey is hard. But you can't do this on your own. You've got so many people that will help you along the way. So it's really important to appreciate their time, to appreciate their their resources, and genuinely like show that thanks and be grateful for that. So on a personal level, you can start to do a journal or write stuff down on what you're grateful for. I have, and this is one of those things that I personally can't explain. I don't know the science behind it, but what I can tell you is like, by writing stuff down or by thinking about it, reflecting on it, you genuinely feel more happier because you are reflecting on the good and the positive things in your life rather than what's going wrong. Because, if you think about what's going wrong, there's a lot of things that can happen, particularly given the fact that we're living in the C world right now with COVID. So it's really important to, like focus on the things that are going well, and be grateful for them. I would also say that, as an extension of that is appreciating other people, saying thank you and being grateful. That could be your team members, that could be, broader stakeholders, whatever it is, that stuff again goes a really long way. And things that I've seen, like good founders do, for example, I might, ask someone, hey, do you need any help? And they say, well, we're looking for introduction to X mentor or X investor or this company or whatever. And I'll sort of go and reach out to them and I'll make an introduction or whatever. Now, the sort of good founders, what I've seen is they continue to build on those relationships and they will do a follow-up. So they will tell you, hey, we already followed up with this person. This is how the meeting went. Thank you so much for making an introduction, right? Now, to me, it doesn't matter if they say thank you or not. But at the same time, by them doing that, it builds a closer relationship and then gives me an incentive to want to work with them again, or want to support them again, want to recommend them again to other people, right? And it's a really good practice. And therefore, I think gratitude is so important in all sorts of ways. Also, your startup and your work won't be successful just because of you. So the other thing, whether that's on social media, LinkedIn, Facebook, wherever, also try and give credit to other people where you can. Because again, that's something that will build trust, but it also build your credibility because, when you're working with all these amazing people, people can see that. And then again, it will build that trust and that credibility for you. So I know I've gone through a bunch of different things, and we're almost nearly near the end. So bear with me here. We've got a couple other things. One other thing that I think is super important is, as a founder and a CEO, what you should be thinking about is doing an energy audit. And really trying to manage your energy rather than managing your time. This is even more especially important right now that a lot of us are working from home or in remote contexts. But like all of us have different personalities. There's stuff that we absolutely love doing. There's things that we just absolutely hate. And there's a lot of stuff that sort of stands in the middle. And so it's really important that you spend time doing what you love. And stuff that actually energizes you. And so again, the rule of thumb here is what you're trying to optimize is get to the 80-20 rule. So ideally, you want to, get to a stage where 80% of your time is focused on doing stuff that actually gives you energy rather than take your energy away. And you can obviously think about that in your own perspective. So whether you love talking to people, whether you love, like looking at spreadsheets, whether you love, doing some other kind of work, whatever it is that you love doing or you get energy from is stuff that you should be spending more time on. And the way to get started on that is doing a bit of an energy audit. So reflect on your practices, reflect on the different activities that you've done in the last few weeks. Look at the things that gave you energy, look at the things that took energy away from you, and then try to do more of the things that actually do give you energy. Obviously, we can't get to a stage where you 100%, spend your time on stuff that gives you energy. But if you can reduce that, that's great. And I know that a lot of people have that fear that, well, if we do that, then no one, there's a bunch of tasks that just won't get done because no one wants to do them. Yes, that's possible, but it is oftentimes a misplaced risk because they're different people are different and like doing different things. So for example, what Marlo doing doesn't necessarily mean that's stuff that I love doing, and vice versa. And so, when you are building and crafting that team, it's really important to know what are your strengths and weaknesses and what is the stuff that gives you energy and doesn't give you energy. And that will also mean that you can outsource some of the work to other people, but also, even hire people as you sort of grow your team as well, who love doing the things that you might not want to do. So those things can get covered as well that way. And finally, and I know that I've taken a bunch of time here, so I'll wrap up here. But finally, and probably the most important point here is on health. And this is where, I know that there's, Ariana was asking this as well, on how do you switch off. And I think that this is such a key important point that, building a company, building a startup takes a massive physical and mental toll on you. And this is even in the best of times, it will affect your health, just because, it's a very stressful environment. There's a lot of uncertainty. Oftentimes you're giving up, a paid gig, a stable life to do this. And so it's really, really important to make sure that you take care of your health, right? And health, as you know, you can divide it into physical and mental health. With physical health, you should exercise, run, walk, do whatever you can to keep on top of your physical health, because it is connected to both your mental health, but also your productivity. So if you don't do it just for the sake of taking care of your health, you should do it because it generally helps your startup. And oftentimes, we tend to lag on taking care of our health, particularly doing exercise. I've been in the same situation. So in that context, if you can, I would say find a buddy, whether it's a friend, whether it's your partner, who can help keep you accountable, and make sure that you actually do some exercise every day, even if it's half an hour walk around the block. Doing stuff like that will really genuinely help you. I was actually talking to a neuroscientist actually on my birthday. I did this really interesting Airbnb experience with a neuroscientist in a pub, where he put an EEG machine on top of your head, and then measures different people's neurons or whatever else. It was really fun time. But what he was talking about was this really critical thing, that when you do physical exercise that increases your heart rate, you actually create new neurons, and you actually are able to remember new things, create new connections, and have better cognitive capacity. So it's really, really, so physical health will genuinely impact your productivity and the work you do in your startup. I can say that as a disclaimer that I'm not a doctor, so you can do your independent research on this. But this is something that I've I've personally experienced. I can also mention on the mental health side that it's really important as founder that you have someone to speak to. So you have obviously this community of other founders, which is amazing because you can talk to each other. You can share your journey, what you've been going through. It is totally okay to talk to a counselor or a therapist. I know there's a stigma, particularly in different cultures, around talking to a therapist, around getting counseling. But I would say it doesn't have to be. You don't have to get only counseling when your mental health is really deteriorating. Although it's really important that you do that. But you also can get counseling when your mental health is good, because you want to proactively keep it better, and continue to work on it. Because it's one of those things, again, just like exercise, you wouldn't only exercise after you've gained a lot of weight, you can also exercise just to stay healthy, right? So it's the same way. That's something that I would say is super important. And also, take breaks, For some of you, it might work, do meditation. I also say, to try to take some time off, whether that's, like at least 1 day a week during the weekends, or if you can do that, maybe take even like a month off every, 6 months or a year. And the reason why I say that is because, as startups, and as founders, we feel this added responsibility that, okay, we've got to do everything today. And there's this real sense of urgency, which is what makes us who we are as founders. But at the same time, it really affects your health. And so you should be able to engage in some of the guilty pleasures, and take some time off as well, because that's super, super important. Our next session is actually focused on mindfulness and well-being by Peter Quinn. So he will, dig a bit more deeper into this stuff as well. So, like that's something that he can talk about. But we've got about 15, 20 minutes.